See that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about the impacts of the algorithm, just exploring some of the social and cultural outcomes of it. So starting off, when I started writing my paper, I came across this study that was talking about how much data Google's collecting on us every day. And before that, I kind of already came to terms that my information was being collected and being stolen by whichever digital service I use. And I kind of assumed that they already knew all the basics, probably some browsing history and a profile of my advertising preferences. But so what the study showed is that among the collected data was usernames, email addresses, payment card data, exact geographic locations, things that I kind of already knew about. But the part that freaked me out was that the researchers concluded that every 12 hours, Google roughly collects and sends about 1 megabyte of data to their servers per user. So to put this into perspective, 1 megabyte can store roughly 500 pages of raw text. And 1 megabyte every 12 hours over a year is 730 megabytes, which is analogous to roughly 365,000 pages of raw text of data per year per user. So what does Google do with all this information? According to Google, they don't sell it. But instead what they do is they bid off our information to the highest buyer, which technically sidesteps what selling data is, but it's effectively the same thing. And what futurists and social theorists alike are beginning to fear is how these media giants are parsing our data with these algorithms and how it could potentially lead to chaos and instability in our social fabric. But let's start first with some context about what the algorithm really is. In pop culture, we have a bunch of stories of machines gaining sentience, rebelling against humans, and basically going out of their way to destroy humanity. So we have Blade Runners, Terminators, etc. And this fear of the inanimate becoming animate and sentient is seemingly universal. But algorithms aren't as mystifying as they seem. They're simply just a computer process that collect and parse data that are specific to the intention of the programmer. So for example, a social media algorithm collects data on users and content, and they come up with functions that map relevant content to relevant users. And something like artificial intelligence is basically just a combination of many different algorithms. And there are some amazing examples of artificial intelligence and algorithms today. An example that I can think of would be AlphaGo, which is a machine learning program that beat the strongest Go players in the world. But even so, though many futurists do believe that the advent of beyond human artificial intelligence could be as little as a few decades away, it looks like it won't result in humanity being quashed by malicious machines. So what will the progress of algorithms look like in the future? And with all of that data that Google collects on us, what kind of impacts can we anticipate? So starting off with a bit of context about why some of these futurists are so worried about these algorithms. In recent years, top executives at massive social media companies offered a peek behind the curtain. They expressed the current and potential danger of these algorithms and how the danger was only exacerbated by the current era of post-truth. Now, post-truth is defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So why are these experts worried about post-truth? What once served as a comically unreliable computer has morphed into a series of services that are deeply integrated into our lives and cultures. The Google search algorithm, for example, has already become entrusted by billions of people to search for relevant and trustworthy information. And our our ability and willingness to search for accurate information is beginning to be bartered away for the convenience of Google. Today, Google controls approximately 92% of all internet searches, and they have analytic code running on approximately 85% of all sites on the internet, which is a lot of information. But realistically, post-truth began long before the algorithms of Google and trusting exactly what Google says. An example of this can be propaganda. So East German historian Wolfgang Ruge once noted in his prolific work on Nazi propaganda that it far eclipsed all previous heights of the demagogy of German imperialism and was a widespread success. So going back to why these experts are so worried, with just a tiny, tiny fraction of the resources and data that a corporation such as Google or Facebook have today, the social impacts of propaganda in the Nazi period were immense. They could shape reality, they could bend truth. So obviously Google and Goebbels are completely different, but it does serve as an example of how much social power Google, which is a private corporation, potentially has. And a more symbolic than practical example of this over-reliance on algorithms and this era of post-truth can be seen in March 2012, when 3 tourists in Australia drove their car straight into the Pacific Ocean. And the 22-year-old driver later explained to press that they were just following the directions on the GPS, which told them that there was a road literally in the middle of the ocean. So essentially, we're in a period where truth is fluid. Corporations have enormous data banks full of our information, which raises the question of what can these algorithms do with all this information they've collected, and why are they so seemingly dangerous? So the use of algorithms to help us make decisions are already integrated into the lives of billions around the world. At a naive level, we rely on the information of algorithms to represent or to recommend movies to us on Netflix, to show us the most engaging 10-second micro videos on TikTok and Instagram, and to tell us to take the side route home because of a traffic blockage on Google Maps. There were supposed to be some photos about TikTok and Netflix that don't seem to have shown up. But these examples are only the absolute peak of the iceberg. In 2012, futurist Yuval Noah Harari speculated that in the future, we may see people counting on algorithms to decide what we study, where to work, and who to marry. And just shy of 4 years later, some of Harari's predictions have already hit the global stage. So recently, it was revealed that mega dating platform Tinder, with its 66 million users, is being operated by an algorithm, which in itself is not that surprising of a fact. But what was surprising is that this algorithm was designating and regulating to each user a desirability score. So effectively, the algorithm takes what we think is an unknown set of parameters, we don't really know what they are, and they assign each user a score and uses the score to suggest potential Tinder profiles to users, which is effectively helping us choose love, or at least choosing who to date. And also some of Harari's examples about jobs being automated and chosen for us is already in widespread use even before he mentioned it. So there's a multitude of job search engines and job hiring that's being assisted, if not having entire sections completely automated by AI. And the progress of these algorithms is accelerating, and they're already planting their roots in these less trivial, deeply personal sectors of our lives. So today we already have hundreds of thousands of resumes that are being screened by artificial intelligence, and Google's job search engine is already analyzing our digital profiles to show us jobs that match us. But this isn't to say that algorithms are going to be perfect decision makers. They make mistakes, will inevitably suffer from biases encoded by their programmers, but ultimately they don't have to be perfect. What Harari mentions is that the bar isn't that high. It's simply just to be better on average than humans, and that they're rapidly approaching. So with these decisions being delegated to machines, what kind of impacts can we see in other fundamental aspects in our lives? According to a massive interdepartmental study conducted at Oxford, an estimated 47% of total US employment is at risk of becoming automated or computerized. And the general consensus in literature is that this increased automation will lead to the gradual decline of employment in routine intensive occupations, which are defined as occupations that consist of well-defined and repetitive procedures or tasks that can be easily codified in software. Routine jobs already have computers and robots, and they've already been the standard in the industry for some time now. Global shipments of industrial use machines have increased by more than 60% between 2000 and 2012, and total sales in 2012 were in the range of $28 billion, and this number is only growing. According to some futurists, the direct effects of this computerization in the labor market workforce can already be seen and explained by some of the current low rates of employment. But as we've seen, the work of labor market robots is optimal in large part because there's a set of well-defined rules. They have a confined environment that they're placed in. So in a programming sense, the environment's really controlled and the parameters are easily quantified. The range of mistakes is really easily foreseeable and it's discrete. Basically, everything is easy to understand. There's a simple set of rules to follow, and the machines can know pretty easily when they've made a mistake. And yet, with growing servers and data banks full of information and stronger computational algorithms, a wide range of non-routine cognitive tasks are also becoming computerizable. For example, healthcare diagnostic tasks are already being assisted by IBM's Watson, which is an artificial intelligence computer which pulls from a database of over 600,000 medical evidence reports, 1.5 million patient records and clinical trials, and 2 million pages of text from medical journals. And it parses this information to recognize patterns and assist in the diagnosis of cancer. So given this current trend, it's no stretch to imagine how quickly and how plausible it is for 47% of the American workforce to become computerized. So following this trend, what kind of social changes can we anticipate? Our non-trivial decisions are being taken from us and jobs are already being automated. So Harari comes back and delivers a really poor prognosis of the automation of the workforce. And he speculates that after the job market settles into its new AI-assisted equilibrium of 47% of the jobs being automated, he thinks that it will usher in a new quote-unquote useless class in society. He argues that as automation becomes the cheapest general form of labor and there are fewer jobs available as humans are becoming outclassed by their AI assistant counterparts, we may see the beginnings of a very permanent and very uncrossable fissure that divides society's classes. As baseline qualifications for jobs become more and more demanding, the resources and time required will also increase. And as a result, the impoverished and less fortunate may be unable to keep up with the increasing capital demands of joining a workforce. And without a serious overhaul of the deeply entrenched free market economy that regulates much of the West, the lower class will greatly suffer from a shortage of jobs, a lack of relevant education, and also an insufficient mental stamina to continue learning new skills. This ever-widening fissure essentially limits the autonomy of these lower classes as progression through the social ladder becomes unrealistic or even impossible, thus earning Harari's less than glamorous title of the useless class. However, it's not all dark. Other futurists such as Martin Ford have questioned the extent of an underqualified population's role on increasing that rigidity between classes, and he presents more nuance. Both of these futurists agree that there are a large series of rungs missing on the skills ladder, especially at these intersections between classes, and that these rungs are being removed at an increasing rate. But Ford argues that the problem is not necessarily with the skills ladder, but rather that the skills ladder is not much a ladder at all, but it's rather a pyramid, which he says there's only so much room at the top. So the issue is not only automation of jobs, but also the inherent structure of the hierarchical social system that govern much of our world. Ford notes that one of these social outcomes of automation is the inflation of credentials. So occupations that once required only a high school degree are only open to those who have a 4-year college degree. So the master's is the new bachelor's and so on. And this implies that these roles themselves have not changed dramatically to warrant a degree in professional or technical expertise, but rather they just shifted all the baseline qualifications up because that pool of candidates was just completely overpopulated, so they had to filter from it. Ford says that as machine learning algorithms begin to gradually consume much of the base of the job skills pyramid, the greater the job deficit will be, and the more aggressively the credentials will inflate, which is what eventually alienates the lower economic classes. So we found out that our societies are more susceptible to a malleable truth. Algorithms are collecting enormous amounts of data on us. They're starting to be so effective that we rely on them to make decisions, and they're taking away our jobs. And this is all pretty dark. So what potential solutions do some of these futurists have moving forward? Harari envisions much less of a solution, but more of an inevitability. He thinks that the future will be devoid of choice and will favor a tyranny, pointing to the trend of AI's eclipsing the human's ability to grow. And Harari sees that whoever has the most powerful AI will essentially consolidate their power further. Nations competing on the international stage will gain their bleeding edge through artificial intelligence. And as artificial intelligence increases, nations will start to rely on these artificial intelligence algorithms to make better decisions for their people, their economy, their culture. And what Harari says is, unlike references in science fiction, the fear behind AI is not the potential of their rebellion, but the opposite, which is that they'll probably always obey their human masters. What this means is that, as we know, artificial intelligence, the acceleration of it, the accuracy of it depends directly on how much data we have. And the larger the pool of data, the more information it can parse to recognize patterns and the better choices it can make. And reasonably, this would suggest that the nations that have the most information on their citizens, the more information in general will be able to make those better decisions with the AI. And this suggests nations that have stronger surveillance programs or have centralized power and collect all that data, which Harari basically points out as a tyranny. So he believes that what it will inevitably happen will be an increased centralization, class division, and a crisis of purpose. But Ford comes back and he looks towards a possibility that's slightly brighter, which includes a new paradigm of human purpose. So he starts off by pointing to the education system as a source of volatility in the workforce. And in a retort of Harari's arguments that a lack of education is one of the key factors in enforcing lower class rigidity, he argues that simply investing into education is not exactly the solution. Because right now, 27% of graduates in Canada are overqualified for their job. This number goes even higher in places like China, which have 43% of graduates overqualified for their jobs. And according to Ford, the average incomes of new college graduates are in steady decline for more than a decade. In fact, most of these college graduates are landing jobs that happen to be relatively routine and have a high demand for consistency and procedural work. And it just so happens that these kind of jobs are controlled, easily quantifiable, and discrete, which is the exact same qualities that that AI are extremely well versed in when it comes to automation. So seeing as these returns on investments in education are diminishing, Ford, as many other futurists do, start to make an argument for the implementation of universal basic income. He argues that this would allow everyone the means to participate in a free market and directly stimulate the economy, even when they're removed from the workforce. And he argues that a universal basic income would provide a safety net for individuals, serving as an umbrella to replace other government assistance programs, such as minimum wage, food stamps, welfare, and housing assistance. And he sees UBI as the most effective solution for automation, noting that if we don't adopt it, then Harari's speculations and future projections might just come true and will inevitably end up with an expansion of traditional welfare state, a rise of uncontested bureaucratic power, mass housing for the disenfranchised. So in conclusion, technology has no intention to slow down, and nor should it. As a collective, we've seen unimaginable leaps and bounds in growth due to accelerating technological advancement, with unprecedented improvements to quality in life. However, as we indulge in our newfound convenience and comfort, we put ourselves at risk of losing some control over our lives. And in a growing era of post-truth, the ability of these algorithms to influence and manipulate only increases. With what feels like kind of a positive feedback loop, the decisions we delegate to machines often allow these machines to make better decisions, which makes us want to choose the machine's decision more often. And these algorithms today are already helping in non-trivial decision making, like decisions on love, decisions on work, and decisions on school. So a crisis of automation is quickly displacing all of these workers in our workforce, and a combination of all the above effects are threatening to entrench permanent divisions between social classes, which is a really dark prognosis. But we find ourselves in what Martin Ford describes as a transitory stage in our timeline. So as technology advances, so do we as humans, and culturally as humans. We discuss new incentives and new purposes, and paradigm shifting technologies are already being introduced and discussed, such as universal basic income. And ultimately, it seems as though the potentials of the algorithm on society and humanity are as limitless as their perils. And currently we have the power to shape which spectrum our future will head towards. Thank you.
Wow. So, you know, what really interests me about this presentation is using the same references that you used. You could have talked about other things which are actually wrong, like using those same references. Yuval Noah Harari predicted in September 2018, in that same article that you cited, that in the future, all human culture will be wrecked because human culture, every plot of every movie, novel, play, TV show depends upon human decision making. And if humans are not making the big decisions, then human culture will be wrecked. And I said that that's ridiculous because humans are adaptable. If we put all this extra intellect around, you know, machines helping us and augmenting our own intellect, there are wonderful things that we can do that will actually enhance human culture. And one is that in some sense, FOMO, the fear of missing out, will be gone. That won't be a problem anymore. You got two things at the same time in the same day. You can go to them both. You can have a sort of digital avatar that attends one and the biological you attends the other.
Right.
And so that video that I did on multiple instances of self, which is closely related to the fact that most of the students last term got cardboard cutouts of themselves. So that, and the poem within it about multi-threading basically influenced Yuval Noah Harari to stop saying that human culture would be wrecked. And so what's so fascinating for me is you didn't say that also. You left out the inaccurate part of his articles. You may have done that knowing exactly all of what I just said, or you may have done it for other reasons. Maybe that argument didn't satisfy you. As you read that Atlantic article and prepared this presentation today, maybe the thing about human culture being wrecked just didn't resonate with you, and that's the reason you didn't make it a part of the presentation. But it's also kind of cool to think we in this course are having real influence. We're not just observers, we're actually changing things. And that multiple instances of self, video and the multi-threading poem and so on, actually changed what a famous author was saying from that point onward. So that poem, just like the reference is, September 2018, that poem is also September 2018. And it doesn't stop there. Like any one of you could do something in this course that has a big impact on the rest of the human race. So that's what I'm saying. Don't think small. Don't think that, I just gave this presentation because it was a requirement for the course, but nobody's going to watch it. It's not going to do anything. That could turn out to be absolutely wrong, not only for you, but for any of the other students. So that's a fun fact to think about, right? That we can actually shift these things. And within a very bright person's writing, there can be something that's flawed that we can push back on, whereas probably the rest of the stuff there is reasonably accurate. So, sorry for going on. Okay, who else has questions?
I do have a partial question comment because I did, look into a lot of Harari's work on the useless workforce and stuff like that. And it seems like he's also a proponent of, having UBI, Universal Basic Income. But in one of the talks I watched, he did emphasize, and I thought this is a really good point, that if we implement universal basic income for it to work, it should be global instead of on the national level, because if it's, just essentially developed countries implementing this, countries in the global south will be left behind, especially countries that rely on a lot of their workforce for manual labor that will be automized in the future. For example, the garment industry. So Indonesia relies almost, solely on the garment industry. So once that's automated, that's a huge workforce that's out of the question. So if it's just, Canada that has universal basic income, that's all well for Canada, but what about the rest of the world? So I thought that was just an interesting point to bring up.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't see that talk, but it makes a lot of sense. Because if you have that universal basic income supplied only to a specific nation, then you have that imbalance between nations, especially if there's not a lot of international trade, specifically through some nations. Then those nations will get left out, and they won't have the same economic stimulus that the countries and nations that have UBI will have.
So you may have heard me say this before, but I just think it's important for you all to sort of recognize this. In the front matter, for the soft cover version of the book Homo Deus, there is a promo from Huffington Press saying that Yuval Noah Harari is so articulate that you almost hate to criticize anything that he says. And in fact, that is what happens. There's except for our stuff, there's very little criticism. And it's interesting. So that's also empowering. I mean, when you read something like that, you would say, well, millions of people are reading this book. Therefore, if I have an idea about it, I'm competing with all of them and nobody will ever listen to me. But actually, that's not what most people think. As they're reading the book, they say, this guy is so much more articulate than me that I could never argue with him. It says so right in the front matter for the book that I'm reading. And so it never occurs to them to complain about any of the facts or anything. So that makes it much more empowering for the people who actually do want to, argue or push back. You're not really competing with very many other people doing that, which is a really surprising fact in itself. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Okay, well, I really enjoyed that, but I'm obviously biased. So anyway, all right, I think we should go on then to the third presentation.
Hi, that would be me.
Yeah.
I'll just start sharing my screen now. All right, hello. Today I'm going to be talking about nanotechnology and its implications on revolutionizing medicine. So first of all, I'd like to start with a little bit of an anecdote. I think I told Dr. Soles this when I was interviewing to get into this course. I read this story when I was about, I think, maybe 10. And it was like what, written maybe 30, 40 years ago. And I just wanted to maybe demonstrate the climate about what I want to be talking about. Even back then, this was the view. It was about just a society where people had nanotechnology implemented within them. It was like a fusion, kind of like Ray Kurzweil's vision, which I'll be discussing a little bit later. And basically no one can get hurt because anytime any damage would occur, these nanorobots would immediately fix it. And it caused this absolutely distressing world where people are getting super depressed because, well, there's really no purpose in life. They can't hurt themselves. Killing oneself was extremely difficult. And people really didn't have any forms of entertainment. Nothing was risk-taking, nothing was exciting anymore. And then this game show came out where this scientist invented kind of a chair where the participant would sit down, answer a couple of questions. If they got a question wrong, it would be kind of like a Russian roulette for one of their vital organs that would be destroyed. And that show is pretty much the most exciting thing that happened to the world since those nanotechnology were introduced. And it was a really cool story. Basically, the scientist ends up dying because he gets put on the chair to increase those levels of entertainment. And they ask him about the name of the first contestant, and he couldn't remember it. Either way, this was maybe written like what, 30 years ago, and it just visualized this dystopian vision of a nanotechnological fusion with the human body. And I think nowadays we can safely say that that's probably not going to happen, and discuss the other implications that might occur. So today's talking points are going to be about the current research and application of nanotechnology, future predictions of nanotech, ethical and social implications and dilemmas, and a discussion and a Q&A. So for the current research, there's so much to talk about. I could never condense it into one presentation, so I just picked out the most exciting ones that I could find. So the first one we'll be talking about is chemotherapy. So chemotherapy was introduced in the 1940s as a standard clinical practice to treat cancer. And even though it's 80 years later, the side effects are still pretty prominent. People get hair loss, memory deficits, concentration problems, fatigue, anemia, etc. So then researchers at the National Cancer Institute came up with this device, this nanoparticle, that packaged TNF-alpha. TNF-alpha is a cytotoxic agent that stands for tumor necrosis factor alpha. When it's packaged inside these nanoparticles, the nanoparticles are then coated with gold, like pure gold. They're injected in your system. They pass by through your blood vessels without any problems. Your immune system doesn't attack them. They're deposited at the tumor site where the TNF-alpha is released. And they actually found that the TNF-alpha does not affect the adjacent healthy tissue, which happens a lot with chemotherapy. It actually just affects the tumor. And so that was extremely a breakthrough invention. Cytomune Sciences has proposed a drug for this called Site6091, and it's actually proven to be successful in mitigating tumor growth, inhibiting growth, and reducing metastasis. And they just passed, I'm pretty sure, their phase 1 trials of the drug. So they're going to be going on to continue testing the drug in clinical trials. Another one of these applications is cardiovascular disease. Researchers at MIT and the Harvard School of Medicine discovered that if you take this one nanoparticle and you coat it with a type of protein, they call them nanoburrs. These nanoburrs basically are attracted to damaged arteries. They look for something called the basement membrane inside your arterial wall, which is only exposed if your artery is damaged. So then the nanoparticles, or the nanoburrs, they attach themselves into this excuse me, basement wall, and they deposit an anti-scarring drug called paclitaxel, or the clinical name is Taxol. And it prevents any cell division and blocks scar tissue growth so that the artery doesn't actually get blocked from any scar tissue. Another one of those applications is preventative healthcare. I'm pretty sure Thomas mentioned this in his presentation for the first time, but this talks about cell senescence and aging. So cell senescence is programmed cell death. It just does so because the body wants to prevent injury to adjacent cells. Usually, the body also clears these pretty quickly. However, when the body ages, the senescent cells tend to accumulate in the body, which cause a cascade of inflammatory response. So in order to fight that, a team of Spanish scientists led by Jose Ramon Maria came up with this one nanoparticle. It's a oligosaccharide-coated mesoporous silica nanoparticle, and it targets this one enzyme that's released by senescent cells called beta-galactosidase. And so it's extremely targeted drug delivery. They find these cells and they clear them, and they actually have shown that it shows like a marked improvement in effects of aging and aging phenotypes. So moving on to future applications of nanotechnology. These are all somewhat theoretical. Some have been invented, some have been employed, but overall they're still pretty theoretical. It's in the works. There's this thing called the pill cam. It's like a sensory camera. You swallow it, and then it allows doctors and physicians to see inside of you in order to come up with a better healthcare plan for you. It was actually approved like 20 years ago, and they're still in the process of optimizing it. Another one of these inventions is something called the vibrant capsule, which is kind of self-explanatory. It just vibrates So it's a physical laxative rather than a chemical laxative. Another one is, this one's really interesting to me, is a dose tracking pill. This one has like a sensor that's relayed usually through a lanyard that the patient wears, and it sends a notification to themselves and their caring physician. It's extremely new, and actually, I'm going to talk about this too. The FDA approved one of these, but not for just like a dose tracking pill. It's just a dose tracking pill. This one can actually release medication in controlled amounts, should you design it to do so. The one that was approved does not, because it gets into ethical dilemmas, which I'll be discussing later under the ethical section. Another one of these, which is kind of prevalent now, are NANOPATCH vaccines. These vaccines would eliminate a huge problem with refrigeration, storage, and administration of these vaccines. It would be like given through silicone microneedles, and it will offer pain-free method, and you wouldn't need as much of the vaccine to actually produce the same effect. So it would theoretically lessen maybe the side effects of vaccines that are common, so like a fever, like a sore arm. So in terms of the long-term futuristic visions, it's worthwhile to take a note at Ray Kurzweil's vision. He says that it's radical life extension, and the full realization of nanobots will basically eliminate biological disease and aging. I think we'll see a widespread use in 20 years of nanotech devices that perform certain functions for us. In 30 or 40 years, we will overcome disease and aging. The nanobots will scout out organs and cells that need repairs and simply fix them. It will lead to profound extensions of our health and longevity. Now, while this sounds like an absolutely outlandish vision, like we're probably definitely not going to be immortal by 2040, the groundwork is actually there. You think about it, something like a senescent cell, if you can clear that away, you can reduce the aging phenotypes quite a lot, and maybe you can actually just stop them from aging, period. And like the singularity is coming, so this might actually be an option. So now, ethical and societal considerations of advancing nanotech. There's a new emerging field of nanotech called nanoethics, but the question begs to be answered, is this really necessary? There's a law professor called Roger Brownsworth that thinks that this shouldn't be a thing, that all of the ethical considerations that should be asked, we already have, and we can just apply to the new nanotechnology. So ethical questions that probably should be addressed are these following. It's like, what specific field of nanotechnology should be assessed? What are the objectives of the specific field of nanotechnology? Are these objectives ethically desirable, and will further development of the field of research contribute to the realization of these objectives? What are the ethical problems connected with further development of the field of research, and are these ethical problems surmountable? Even though these aren't actually the standard ethical procedure for every nanotechnology out there, these are definitely questions that should be addressed when considering emerging technologies. Now, caveats with these are the fact that we don't really know the long-term impacts because we haven't implemented these nanotechnology devices yet. So for the dose tracking pills that I previously mentioned, they usually last in a patient's stomach for about a month. What if the patient wants to revoke consent for medication administered at an automatic rate? Then can they just remove it from their system? There's a problem there because the patient doesn't have full autonomy of their own body, whether, for example, when you're taking oral medication, you can just stop taking it. So in 2019, the first smart pill was approved by the FDA. A company called eTechRx secured this approval, and it was only a sensory pill that's ingested and also functional for about a month, and it just analyzes drug levels and dosage ingested by the patient, sends the notification by the lanyard to the patient and their physician, and it's only sensory and it doesn't release any medication. So this bypasses a lot of the issues with the consent problem that we talked about before, because then the patient still chooses to take their medication at their own discretion. They're just monitoring their dosage levels. Is this ethical? Factors to consider is, well, the app can be hacked. Do medical insurance companies have unlimited access to this information? in the United States, studies suggest that up to 50% of the patients do not follow through with the whole course of treatment and do not refill their prescription, for example. So this costs medical insurance companies billions of dollars every year because they keep returning to the doctor. In Canada, healthcare costs increase when patients return to medical care centers and doctors for symptomology solvable just by taking their medication. If medical insurance companies did, however, have access to this information, would patients then feel coerced into taking their medication to avoid higher insurance premiums? These are all questions that should be asked. So to revisit Ray Kurzweil's vision, he envisions immortality in 2040. The public, however, seems to completely lean away from this. In a 2016 survey done by the Pew Research Center in the United States, about 55% did not want nanotechnology to emerge and did not want a fusion of the human body with nanotechnology, citing two main concerns: that this technology will strip us of our humanity, and that this technology will make us obsolete. It's sort of like AI. However, the latter doesn't really apply in terms of nanotechnology, but it should definitely be mentioned. When we think about the advantageous impacts of nanotech, we think about economic flourishing. The industry is expected to grow by 28% annually, and next year it's expected to exceed about $3 billion in value. There's obviously also improved patient quality of life when you remove factors like disease, like aging. Patients generally have a better quality of life. So for that survey, revisiting it again, there's a divided public opinion. However, there was one extremely interesting observation that was noted. When asked about if Americans were in favor of research to provide patients with vision deficits or blind patients with artificial sights, a strong and overwhelming majority agreed. So now this begs the question, are people more okay with just eliminating disease rather than human enhancement? So since one of these goals of the nanotechnology is just treating human disease and also human enhancement, where's the line that divides the public? And it seems to be that this line is when it comes to human enhancement. People avoid playing God. They just want to eliminate the disabilities and give everyone sort of an equal playing field. So in conclusion, I'm pretty sure I think that nanotechnology is kind of a double-edged sword. There's a fine line between human enhancement and just treating disabilities and disease that needs to be regulated. So such a framework needs to be established, and I think it has to be established globally in order to sort of even the playing field among everyone. The nanotechnology has completely advanced, and perhaps in like what 2040, like Ray Kurzweil envisions, we'll actually be immortal, and we'll look back on this time of doubt and just think that our highest imagination that was seen in blockbuster films actually came true. So let's discuss. Does anybody have any opinions on nanotech they would like to share?
I just have a quick question.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if you know, it's totally okay if you don't, but that approved smart pill, like how does it send information? Like how does it collect and send information to the wearable?
Bluetooth, via Bluetooth. The lanyard is connected via Bluetooth, and then that signal is also then transmitted via Bluetooth to your phone and to the physician's office.
So since the pill does expire at some point, is the like how small is that circuitry? Like does that not affect the human body once it gets dissolved in a way?
I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be harmful. I think it just can pass through the system organically once it's expired, but I'm not actually sure.
So why don't you unshare so that on the recording we can see everybody speaking.
How do I do so? Sorry, just give me a second. Stop share.
Yay. Okay. There we are. Okay, what other comments, questions, debate?
I was just thinking, so does nanotech and using it make us cyborgs in effect, or is it just too insignificant and too small and too behind the scenes for, you know, it to change us so drastically?
Well, right now, the nanotechnology is just completely small, and it's kind of like you said, like an insignificant background thing. However, eventually the goal is to completely physiologically replace a lot of the human blood, vital organs, everything, just so that we can sort of eliminate all possibility of disease and aging. For now, the current research is just that it's tiny and significant. We'll just monitor in the background, but hopefully maybe one day we'll have artificial blood, artificial organs. We can transcend our human bodies in a way.
I guess a follow-up question, something I came across was that sort of gray goo projection of the future if nanotechnology takes over and, you know, we're unable to do anything about it because, you know, that everybody has nanotech. What do you think about these sorts of very worst case scenario projections?
Honestly, I think I tend to agree with Ray Kurzweil in that, like, the definition of human beings is that we're adaptable and dynamic. I think that if we just move over from the definition of that human beings need to be this physiological organic being, then we can just adapt into our new artificial being and just realize that it avoids so much of the suffering that we go through because our bodies will eventually degrade. But I guess like maybe in a worst case projection scenario, then that story that I read about might become true. That would kind of be cool. I'm not gonna lie. Just watching the world implode in a way.
So what Rich Sutton says is we get what we deserve, that like if humanity gets stuck, if like our biological beings are not able to make progress for some reason, and you know, the kind of machine beings around us continue to improve, that's something that in a sense we kind of deserve because we weren't able to figure out how we could keep making progress, right? And like this idea of culture becoming richer, that really requires biological bodies if it's the kind of culture we have now, right? So I mean, and why can't we succeed at that? I think we can, probably can. There are very few people planning at the moment how to make human culture richer, but isn't that like a cool goal to shoot for, right? And then that kind of puts nanotech in a kind of perspective that yes, these little machines inside us are, you know, helping us, but they are incapable of these rich sensory experiences that we as biological beings can have, you know, particularly now with all the added intellect from, you know, machines and so on. So I think, you know, we're not just passive victims of the future. We can help shape it and figure out what should we be aiming for, right? What should be, what is the end goal we're trying to, you know, achieve?
Honestly, I think that nanotechnology in the future is kind of going to be analogous to maybe the microorganisms that we already have now. So like, I don't know, for example, in our gut microbiota, we have a ton of bacteria and other microorganisms that help us out. I think maybe nanotechnology will take on that role, except it'll be so much more efficient and so essentially just faultless, so that we don't have to suffer natural human degradation over a long period of time.
Yeah, and it will improve us beyond what we would be able to be as just, you know, biological beings. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so now some of you wanted to talk about multiple instances of self. I wanted to point out, just like we're just talking about nanobots making us better than we could ever be with just our basic biology, that video of mine of multiple instances of self is better than anything I could ever do without animator Molly Little. It's a lot more amusing and a lot more watchable than it was before we added her animations. So I recommend that video very highly, but the best part is sort of her part. And that creativity is totally hers. I didn't tell her which images to use or where to put them or whatever. But it kind of increases the value of the video to you beyond the basic background of what's there. And gives you the idea. It's sort of hard to define. First of all, what would life be like if we actually had the intellect to keep track of multiple lives at once, not to get them mixed up, right? But on the other hand, if you think about having a lot of extra intellect, what else would you use it for? I mean, suppose that you were suddenly 3 times smarter than you are now. What would you do with that? How would your life be different? You know, if there's just one of you, it might not really make much difference. Maybe it would just be frustrating because the depth of your understanding of life would be so much greater, but the actual stuff you were doing remains the same, right? I never knew how, you know, limited my life is, you know, but now that I'm so much smarter, I can see all the things that I'm lacking and so on, right? So, yeah, but if you then say, well, okay, what we're going to do is make sure that every life experience I want to have, I can have, even ones that would need to be simultaneous and in different physical locations. I can now do all that and keep it all straight. And so, yeah, Tien, I think that's one of the things you wanted to talk about, right? Is what would the relationship between the various instances be? And would they all share a common consciousness, or would they be independent during the day? And it's only when they get together for this wonderful party at night where they're all so compatible that, yeah. So how do you see it going, or what would be ideal?
Okay, so I have a very quantum-based understanding of consciousness. So when I first heard about this multiple instances thing, it instantly reminded me of some literature back in 2012 where they were theorizing how a teleporter would work, in which someone would walk in, they would literally be killed on the spot, but their exact replica would emerge on the other side. How can you be certain that you didn't just die and some clone just replaced you on the other side, free to fulfill whatever instance of their quantum consciousness pervades them? Let's say they were going there and there was like an 80% chance that your mission was to do something, but then there's also that 20% chance you do something else. What if the guy just decides not to do it or does something else, right? Like, it's very hard to say that that entity and that lived experience will be contiguous amongst 2 different like individuals. And so for the idea of multiple instances,
you're Canadian, right? Canadians can change their mind. You can already in a single day just wake up and say, okay, I'm going to do everything completely different now. You know, like it isn't very common to do that, but you have the freedom to do it. And you'd be surprised. Some human beings in Canada living very turbulent lives do change up things fairly frequently, you know. So So I'm not sure that they're so absolutely different if the new copy of you is pretty much identical to the old copy that just died. And if the thought patterns are sort of maintained, then I don't know if that new instance of you decides to do something different. Is that different from you yourself just deciding to change big things in your life, right? So,
Yeah. So just to expand on that point, what I mean at the end of the day is it's hard to think about if that lived conscious experience is something that you would be having, or if it's just two copies, or I mean, using quantum terminology, like viewed instances of uncertainty will appear differently, even if it's based off of the same matter, the same properties. If you view it at this time versus viewing it another time, it could be completely different, even if they are the same thing. And so you have multiple instances, let's say one goes to study and you stay home and watch TV. How do you know that you're getting this studied information given to you, unless there is some form of direct communication or link between your brains? In that case, it could be with anyone, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a direct clone of you. And an extension, is that the best way to do that? Wouldn't there be a better application for achieving those means rather than creating a whole other entity in itself?
see, I don't have any one specific protocol that I think should be followed. I mean, in fact, if you think about what we did in making the cutouts, it was kind of interesting and self-organizing how that worked. Think, okay, you're taking this course, and one of the students involved with the course, Ching-Yin Wong from the University of Montreal, suggests that every student get this coroplast cutout of themselves, right? Well, there needs to be photography. How is that going to be done? And so on. What was sort of interesting about it would have been a bit creepy if it had been just me and the person that I'm photographing, and we're in my 4-car garage. It's kind of, I don't know, but that isn't what happened. Like, the medical students involved were there throughout, right? And actually Simon Wu for the women took most of the pictures. So it wasn't me taking the pictures, it was him. And it just all happened organically, but it was very comfortable from that point of view. There wasn't a feeling of possible, exploitation or something. That's how we felt about it. How did the external world feel? Well, my boss, when he saw the first cutout, he was so suspicious that the students were being exploited and so on. So we went through this big thing of what the consent form should look like. And there are two different forms. One, if your cutout is only like for you and your mother and that sort of thing, is not for public space. Or the other, if it's going to be in AHS and U Alberta public space, right? And actually, I realized the people who felt most strongly about that were not students in the course, just other people watching what we were doing, So even that, the way that unfolded, there were many accidental points in what we did. And the reason that's important is I think it's kind of a metaphor for, okay, when we get to a point where it's actually able to make multiple instances of self, what should their characteristics be? How should they be made? Should you make 5 at once, or are they always sequential? Can they converge back to one again, or do they stay separate for the rest of eternity? How does it work? And I think we didn't make any any assumptions about that. In the video that I did, I pointed out that what you see on the upload program, if you watch that series, it's kind of unsatisfying. Nobody important has multiple instances of self. It's just service people, like waiters and janitors, that sort of thing. And they blur out the actual process of one person going to several. So you can't really see exactly what's happening. And it's not like mitosis or meiosis or something, you know, it has regular stages. It just sort of, you know, there's one person and they blur it out, and then there are multiple copies. And then there are numerous music videos, and it seems to be that without any musician saying so, every, you know, pop musician or rock musician has gotten the idea that the cool way to do music videos now is to have multiple instances of self at some point in the video. And so, and when you look at the text on YouTube, I give all the links there, and maybe Leonard Cohen's first We Take Manhattan is maybe the first instance of a music video like that. And it seems kind of consequential because there's him and Jennifer Warrens walking to the seashore water's edge with this handcuffed briefcase that obviously has like the, you know, nuclear bomb codes or something. And then there are multiple pairs of Leonards and Jennifer suddenly. And then they all sort of go in different directions later. So I didn't assume any one particular, you know, trajectory for what these multiple instances would do, or what they would be like, or how much physicality they might or might not have. I think you can leave all that open. So, you know, Tien, what would you do? Do you think, does the quantum world allow all those different possibilities, or does the quantum world only allow one kind of multiple instances of self?
Okay, so I know this is really, really far out, and by all means, I'm just a third year student. Okay, I don't know the answers to everything, but I mean, here's my hot take, I guess. Right. So consciousness, we know so little about consciousness. I honestly don't think it just resides in physical matter. Like, it's just in the brain. You know, with all of this technology that's been dismantling our current understanding of consciousness, I feel it's, again, I'm not attacking anyone's presentation or shutting down the developments of like mind uploading or anything like that. I just view consciousness as something that we don't understand that much about yet. And given the uncertainty of it, extending that to multiple instances, I guess I'll rewind a bit. So I view consciousness as, or just your being, your lived experience, as like this 4-dimensional shape in time. And so you can take whatever directory you want. There's like a state space for basically everything you could have done, you could have felt, you could have been, all of that. And throughout the course of time, you define that shape. And so just let's say on a 3-dimensional by a 4D axis of time, you would take up this shape. And so if you make another instance of yourself, it could be either the exact same shape or a little bit different or something completely different. Either way, it would be, again, viewing an uncertainty, which will make it into a state that isn't guaranteed to be where it started from. And so you don't have agency over it. That's the message at the end of the day. If you were to make an instance of yourself, it would be like having a child or even just creating life from something. You can't exercise agency over it directly, and your conscious experience would not be the same as that one. And so if I made a clone of myself, we would be arguing about who would be studying, because I mean, I don't think either of us would want to study over doing something fun, for example.
Yeah.
And so like that's why, I mean, in my presentation, and just a thought that I've had for a long time is in application to AI specifically, that's why I feel like narrow AI is probably the way to go. Because as cool as general AI is, a lot of these extensions of what we want to achieve within our lives are black boxed or bounded by a very clean set of just objectives that we want to fulfill. And so instead of making an instance of yourself that would study for you, just have like a module in your head that expands your memory infinitely, or able to process information and thoughts and emotions, all of that much greater to what we can currently do. I just don't agree with the understanding that if you had an exact carbon copy of yourself, that you could consciously experience what it would be consciously experiencing.
I wonder how quantum entanglement would play into this. Like, I was just thinking about it and I was like, okay, by the rules of quantum entanglement, you know, you have two particles, right? For example, like two electrons, and if one is entangled with another electron, if one is spin up, the other one's spin down, right? So then I was thinking, okay, maybe we're only going to be able to have two existing copies of ourselves that are entangled. But then I was like, we have multiple different particles in us, so it's like quantum computing. There's an infinite amount of combinations that could exist. So I mean, who can tell what the nature of how these multiple instances will work, how they will manifest themselves. And one thing I'll just say, like, just to what you said, Tian, about, you know, studying and working on like, you know, building our memory capacities using some sort of, you know, neurotech or something like that. I think the problem with that is because the problem is with education, because education emphasizes the information that's already in your head. Even when we all offload our memories into these things called phones and computers. So that technology already exists. It's just the education system limits our ability to make use of it. That's my one big gripe with the education system. On a whole other tangent now, ethically, like judging by like virtue ethics and things like that, would we only want certain people to make multiple instances of themselves? Like, would we have to ban people from making instances of themselves because they're just bad people and we don't need more of them?
I mean, with the use of this technology, then, I mean, it applies to like atomic or any other really hyper changing technology out there, right? We don't want it to fall into the hands of people who would abuse it. I just think it's impossible to do so from a philosophical standpoint, that you could have another conscious experience or another conscious entity be of your own. Like, I just don't think it's possible. You can create another copy of yourself, but you don't have agency over what it would do in its life. So if you, let's say, cloned Hitler, but this Hitler was good at art and went to art school, then hey, look at that. You have a really good artist now, right? Like, you can't, I just don't believe you can make multiple instances of yourself in the way of expanding or adding on to your conscious experience. And so that technology, in my opinion, just wouldn't exist. You can make copies of people, right? Like, let's say cloning technology gets to that point and you can make clones of yourself ad infinitum. Well, then you would just have multiple, you know, versions of yourself that would have very individual experiences, you know, built off the same DNA. And let's say given a same or different environment, they would just be acting differently. And none of those experiences you would incorporate unless they like talk to you. For example, that people talking to each other is how they share their conscious experience. And so that is no different than what we currently do.
I wonder if there would be any sort of primacy that's given to the original person as a sort of cause of all these other
That's
copies.
another thing. Yeah, like I believe that when you make in the, I guess in the conversation of making multiple instances, they would carry your memories, everything that you had up to that point of being instanced. They would know. So they would know about your birth. They would know about all the traumatic childhood memories you had, and they would just work from there. And so I guess in essence, you can't even distinguish the two, because they both are from the past knowing everything about you. And so they are as you would be. They would just act according to again, the quantum rules of uncertainty.
Oh man, this is so uncanny because this is actually relating to what I did for like a research paper for a course on Catholicism of all things, about like how Catholics and Christians understand the Trinity. You know, like some of the philosophy surrounding that, like it goes like way deep into like time travel and like how multiple instances can simultaneously be different but be one, right? Like how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are seen as one. And this is really surprising to me because it just goes to show how these sort of heuristics from religion and whatever are still actually quite useful in even discussions of multiple instances itself.
So, you know, if you just think about augmentation, like I'm aware, if you take mental illness in people who are at the really fringes of society and heavily impoverished and so on, and if you just fix everything in their environment, sometimes the mental illness just, you know, goes away. It was so related to that. So how does that relate to the influence of being augmented? If you think of a very evil person, a person with a bad personality, with a certain intellect level, right? And you augment that intellect threefold, they may instantly realize I've been wrong, you know? Wow, I've really been wrong about stuff, right? And so it's not going to work 100% of the time. We don't know how many instances of this person instantly becoming like moral and balanced just by having greater intellect, but there will be some instances of that. So it'll be really interesting to see when being evil and really terrible person is a permanent state. No matter how smart you get, nothing fixes it, right? And when it's entirely based on your limited understanding of the world around you. And once that's improved, then the disorder just goes away. So this is something else that we will discover.
I wonder if it would be useful for people with, limited intrinsic motivation who already are at that base level where they don't have the motivation to, or the energy to engage with the world. Like, would multiple instances of self be effective in sort of inspiring motivation? Would it be able to surmount that barrier? Because I find that that's the biggest thing when we think of the future, because some of us just might not have the motivation to go through all these things, multiple instances of self.
The strange thing about that, in my 74, almost 75 years, the instances of failed human motivation are in very wealthy families, usually the younger children. They realize early on, wow, I really lucked into something here. I live in a mansion and we get all this stuff and I don't have to accomplish anything or do anything. I'll still have a great life, right? And it's so frustrating when you see that happen. And strong efforts are made to keep it quiet, that this one child, is just so darn lazy and just not doing anything useful in the world when they have everything, right? And they just they seem to lack the motivation.
Isn't that the goal of transhumanism, for everyone to already have everything? So isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, no, it is, but we'll gradually figure this out, There probably is a cure for those younger children in wealthy families who decide around puberty or something that they're not going to do anything for the rest of their lives, right? There's a cure for that, and we'll figure out what it is.
I suppose now in this context, it's seen as bad because, you know, you have someone at like what David Pierce is saying, at a higher base level of hedonism, right? While other people are so low. Like, I feel like that there's that inequality aspect that feeds into that not being good. But maybe if we're all at the same base level, then we'll rejoice in other people having great lives.
I wonder, because like a lot of people who are born into wealthier families who are just like, oh, I don't have to do shit to get what I want. I feel like they oftentimes fall into addictions, which is quite interesting because they're so bored and they're just like, oh, drugs. Sorry, I have dirt on my hands because I'm planting. Sorry, this is like very like, we're making a little like propagation station. Yeah, so I wonder, like, I was thinking about if transhumanism would lead to eradication of drugs because, or addictions, because like I was so focused on it being like a physical feeling with like the brain health, and like it's like a physical satisfaction along with like the mental. But yeah, I wonder if like with like mind uploading and like with other beings being able to like perform the same duties and stuff like that, like I wonder if that's going to lead to more addictions maybe. And like maybe we'll have, with like development of like new technology, like maybe we'll have like more sustainable ways where people can like be addicts. Like right now, like a lot of IV users, they're like one of my clients doesn't have any veins anymore that's alive or like considered alive where they can like inject, because like their veins have like just completely died from like the drug use. So I wonder if like technology is going to be somehow utilized that way. And it kind of makes me like concerned, but also really nice, because that means like doctors will continue to have jobs.
I mean, even, oh, sorry.
Oh no. And I like, just to really like quickly go back onto our alternative selves, like metaphysics, which is like the focus part of my like philosophy degree focus is in metaphysics. And it would say that if you like the same clone with like the same historical like experiences or like history is like standing next to you, then you're at a different temporal, like the space isn't the same, so like you're a different person. But then I wonder if that's gonna be applied the same if we no longer have bodies. Like how would we calculate the space and time that we exist? And then it's like a whole new existential crisis to dive into.
Yeah. And people describe having a dial where you can dial up whatever feelings and, you know, sensations you want, but it's much wider than what we could ever experience now. You know, like there'll be whole new, you know, emotional states that nobody's able to access now that will be possible then, and maybe unlimited, you know? So it is kind of hard to figure out how will that turn out in the end then, you know? So,
yeah, I was also thinking like, these are just like my random before going to bed time, like brain rush thoughts. It's like, what if we could tune our bodies so that like breathing makes us high, or like feel like we're getting high, or, you know, like there's just like so many different ways outside of like utilizing, whether it be like lab made or like shed made drugs. Like we don't have to rely on those things to get a crave and like satisfaction we want. And maybe like that will lead a whole new way of addiction recovery treatments that's like more effective and like doesn't take a lifetime. But at the same time, I'm just like, what if without having to do anything, like what if people just want to like breathe and like that's all they do, and like that's like them wanting to, like that's their life and like their goal, and like that's what they're addicted to, if like it somehow be able to like be altered to make themselves feel good.
Well, there will be a sort of ethos of the future, right? We don't know what it will be, but there will be a kind of way of living that people will respect and think, gee, you're doing that really well. And otherwise, where they think you're a complete loser, right? And we don't know what those parameters are yet. What will determine that? It certainly won't be the job that you have, because probably hardly anybody will have jobs eventually. So it'll be other things that determine whether this new standard ethos of society, whether you're fulfilling it, exceeding it, you know, or doing less well at it than anyone else, you know? Yeah. And it's a new way when you meet somebody and get to know them, of figuring out whether they're sort of handling things better than you and you can learn from them, or they have a lot to learn from you, or, you know, yeah. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because I feel like if we logically follow the kind of current paradigm we're in, it'll probably end up leading to some kind of mega addicted state. Because I mean, right now we're already on TikTok. That algorithm's supposed to retain our attention. We're supposed to like, keep getting that hit of serotonin over and over and over again, and it's unscrollable. I mean, it's infinitely scrollable. That's almost like I can't even think of a more sophisticated social media engine.
No, you're absolutely right. Now you would appreciate that I don't know much about Instagram. I've only been on it since February 1st. But initially, when you join, you get this notification, you're all caught up when you've actually looked at everything you can look at that's on your feed, right? But very soon, that is no longer possible. You can't be all caught up. You could be spending your, you know, like now I'm following 5,000 people and there's 1,600 people following me, right? So at that point, you would never be able to spend enough time with your phone to actually see everything that you would want to see. And most people are then in that state. So maybe they're thinking back to the point where they got this message, you're all caught up. And thinking, well, I want to see that again, you know, even if I have to look at 2,000 pictures, you know? So yeah.
It's bottomless.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I would say is, you know, are there healthier addictions than others? Is it healthy to replace a heroin addiction with perhaps some, you know, like a virtual reality addiction where you're, you know, engaging and living in a VR? You know, like, are these addictions equivalent? And I guess,
see, you could create something where you take a person with a terrible personality and they consent then to spend like months and months in this virtual reality game that constantly teaches them like a much better way to live, you know, and the goal of the game is to make them a much better, more useful person that functions better in, you know, society. So.
It's interesting. I don't know. I feel like in the future when like the costs of addiction, you know, addiction viewed as bad mainly because of all the costs and all the negative side effects that come from it, no matter what it would be. You know, if in the future those are all alleviated, the goal might not necessarily be like even in the notion of making bad things good, it's just what you decide to do. Like I know this is a very impartial view of the future, but I honestly think like if we don't have jobs anymore, if it's just up to us to basically realize ourselves in whatever way possible, the whole notion of morality kind of goes out the window as well. Like you would just have groups of people who vibe in a certain way essentially, and there wouldn't be like a good or a bad, as long as there's no like direct interrelational inference that would be like that somebody would impact another person on a solely individual level. There isn't really like a good or bad anymore. Like if they feel satisfaction in doing bad things the same way you do good, why wouldn't they be allowed to do so? it would just be in a better environment, I guess.
But you could create the sort of world you're talking about. You could create another world where the rewards for being good are much greater than they are now, and the penalties for being bad are much worse, right? So you're kind of shaping people into these in a certain definition of what's moral. You're making them much more moral than people are today, because that's simply how the system works. And you could create either one of those kinds of systems or something entirely.
Is it ethical to make people more moral based on your own
It
morals?
might be more evil than anything else you could do, right? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's 4 o'clock. It's probably
Yeah.
logical time to. So what I'm going to do is create 4 videos today. There'll be the 3 presentations, and then 1 just of this multiple instances of self-discussion. And you've probably all realized the way the videos work. It's much harder for me to edit it down to just the one talk. So the person who talks first, their video, actually, if you keep on watching it, is the entire session. But it gets the title of the first person talking. Then the second person, I'm starting with the beginning of the second presentation. It's just easier not to have to do that edit at the back. So it means like today, the video length of the first person presenting will be quite long, but probably nobody will actually watch it, because the latter part of it is not what the title says it is. And people say, oh, what the heck is that? And they'll stop watching, right? So anyway, that's just easier because I'm doing the editing, and also the file size of these Zoom videos is pretty tiny. So it isn't like we're ending up with huge files. You know, they're usually like 1 gigabyte or gigabyte and a half at the most. Whereas if you're shooting regular 4K video, you can end up with huge files, 100 gigabytes, something like that. So yeah. Anyway, so thank you for today, and we'll see you again on Tuesday. Have a great weekend, guys.
Oh God, I have so much dirt on my hands. Bye.
Bye-bye.